the influence between vegetation and water. And here's my background. If you want to contact me, feel free to do so on any questions you have or literature you want that's related to the talk here. So I'll start off. What I'll be talking about today is I'm going to focus on the local changes to climate rather than the global. So I won't be talking much about carbon sequestration or global climate change, but more the local effects that could affect the climate around us. And it's sort of a training about these different processes, some of them that you see here in this illustration. And we'll try to understand the role of each, how they interact with each other, and so forth. So we'll be going over a lot of these hydrological processes that you see in the diagram here. First, I'll start off with has to do with the kind of what they call a geomechanical model for how water comes from the coast and goes inland, like, for example, from our Gulf of Mexico inland to the Central Texas region. And one of the basic physical things to understand is that hot air rises. So if you have hot air, you know, the molecules bounce a lot, nitrogen, oxygen, they're less dense than cool air, so it rises. So that's one basic understanding is that warmer air rises. And so in the case where you have the Gulf of Mexico and Texas, the land mass is warmer when the sun shines on it than the ocean is. And so as a result of warming air causes the air to rise. And if the air has moisture in it and it cools off enough, then it might precipitate as rainfall. And you've also heard this, you know, the scenario where with climate change, you know, the warming of the Gulf waters can intensify tropical storms and hurricanes. And that's sort of related too, because they're the moisture that's hot, is rising, turning around, spinning, you know, providing energy for all kind of dynamics in hurricanes. And I'm switching sides, maybe. Okay. There we go, I'll do this thing. There we go. So one of the concepts I want to introduce you with is the concept of orographic precipitation. Orographic precipitation is primarily used to describe where you have mountain ranges like the Rocky Mountains, or say the Olympic Peninsula, which has mountains, and you've got winds coming off the Pacific coast in Washington State, and it's rising up. There's snow-capped mountains there, so the moisture-laden waters coming off the Pacific coast rise up and cool, and that causes them to rain. You know, the cooling of the air causes it to precipitate rain. So in '67, Carr, who did a study about the climate of Texas, thought that that's a good explanation for why you're getting all this rain, for example, in the Central Texas region, is that the water-laden air is rising something like 1,000 feet as it comes from the Gulf of Mexico to Central Texas. And that little rise in elevation causes it to cool off enough that it encourages the rain, you know, between here and the coast. So this is his hypothesis about that maybe orographic precipitation comes in to explain some of the rain that we're getting here from the Gulf Coast. And so I got a little graphics here. Another scientist, Namias, in 1960, noticed that there's this high pressure system in the plains in the summertime, and that high pressure area kind of keeps rainfall from coming into that area. So it sits there in the summertime, and the rains can't come in because the high pressure pushes the fronts away. So I'll show you a little animation. You know, the arrow is indicating the water coming from the Gulf of the moisture-laden air coming off the Gulf of Mexico, blowing in. And by the way, the Gulf of Mexico, according to Carr, provides more of the rainfall for Arizona and New Mexico than the Pacific coast. So this front of air comes in all the way. But typically, what you'll see from the lines that are the equal rain heights are called isoheights. you know, they're not lined up parallel to the coast, even though the rain's coming this way, but they're kind of like north-south, which is kind of an anomaly. You know, why is it doing that? Some other anomalies that CART couldn't explain, for example, is that why is it raining more on the river basins? In some areas, like in central Texas, you're getting as much rain as you are in some portions of the coast, which is kind of interesting. And so the rain fronts that he described kind of come in from the coast. And I got a little animation. They, instead of going across perpendicular to the shore, they're kind of taking a right angle turn, you know, and going off toward Louisiana and up to the northeast. And we saw that with the last few hurricanes that came across our way. Instead of coming into central Texas, it kind of turned and went up to the northeast, instead of presumably being pushed away because of this high pressure system in the high plains. So that's orographic precipitation. Whoa. Okay, now we're going to get to another concept called albedo. Okay, so albedo is another concept that affects temperature of the Earth's surface. And the concept behind it is sort of like a mirror, that if you've got a surface that reflects the sunlight and the radiation away, then it's going to be cooler, as opposed to something that's going to absorb the radiation, the heat. And so if it's a light surface like snow, which has a really high albedo, that means it reflects like 80% of the incoming radiation to 95% of the incoming radiation, when it has albedo values at 80 to 95. Whereas forests are kind of dark, and they reflect only about 10 to 20% of the incoming radiation. So some people have done climate models, say, well, forests absorb all that heat and radiation because they're dark. So, you know, if you cleared the forest, then you actually cool the Earth's surface by doing that. And croplands and grasslands reflect more of the radiation. The grass, something on the order of 30%, so it reflects more of it. So they expect grasses would be cooler than forests, for example. So to kind of investigate that albedo and to demonstrate it, a good place to do that is the Great Sand Dunes of Colorado. You've got such a contrast in albedo because you've got these bright sand dunes and you've got these dark wooded areas with grass. So I got this crackpot investigative team out there. We're going to investigate the Great Sand Dunes of Colorado and the heat there on that, and demonstrate the albedo there. So one of the things we noticed, the researchers noticed, is their sensors were picking up that the sand dunes were kind of hot. They should be cool, right? Because they're reflecting all that radiation back. But they were really hot to this one researcher who thought we were kind of crazy trying to walk across it. And he tended to walk on the grass that he thought was a lot cooler than the sand. So that's kind of what we call an albedo anomaly, because it's the opposite of what you expect. The grass should be warmer, hotter. The wood should even be darker and warmer than that, hotter than that, than the sands. And it's the opposite. And the point of this is that, well, the point of it is there are other people who noticed that those climate models didn't make much sense. So in Africa, for example, the Sahara Desert of North Africa, kind of like the Great Sand Dunes, you know, based on albedo alone, the Sahara sands should be reflecting the incoming radiation. They should be cooler than vegetative areas in the same region. But the Sahara Desert's sands get as high as 176 degrees Fahrenheit, so they get really hot. It's not what you expect based on albedo alone. And some folks who saw these climate models went and measured areas of the sub-Sahara region in Africa. And what they found is the opposite of albedo is correct, that areas of sparse vegetation with high albedo actually had the highest temperatures. But the dense vegetative areas actually with the lowest albedo had the lowest temperature. And that's again the opposite of what you expect from albedo alone. There's another study by Otterman who used airborne images to estimate from the infrared region what the heat was, and again found that the nuded regions had a higher temperature than the vegetated areas. And so what we learn on here is I'm introducing these different concepts. I'm not saying that albedo is wrong or doesn't apply, but there's some other factor that's affecting the temperature that's way more important than albedo. This is the point I'm making here. Okay, so here, once again, here's some field measurements. This is Maroon National Park. We should do measurements like this here in Texas. This is cool. Measured over a year and found that in the summertime, the grasslands got quite a bit hotter than the woodlands, and the forests were pretty cool, comparatively speaking. And these were also seen in other studies as well. And some of the worldwide models that looked at deforestation believe that about 18% of the current global warming as a result of deforestation. Okay, so some first models I said based on albedo showed that deforestation cools it. Other models coming out are showing that when you clear the vegetation, it's actually heating up the surface, so you get warmer temperatures based on deforestation. So this is kind of an illustration by Kiss the Sky provided to us that shows you the difference between the heat island from the bare surfaces, and the cool covered soil is going to be a lot cooler. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why that is. So one of the other factors of forests is that pretty much everyone agrees that forests diminish runoff. You know, that forested regions don't produce as much runoff to the creeks. Now, one of the studies by Farley and Jackson, Duke University, showed that forested areas reduce the runoff by an average of 44 to 33% when they looked at catchment areas studies all over the world. And Bosch and Hewlett also compiled about 94 catchment. Catchment means that they're measuring the runoff coming off of a basin, and they can compare one basin that has grass and one that has forests and see what the difference is. The difference is these researchers are saying, well, these trees are stealing the water from the creeks, therefore the creeks are not going to flow. They're taking our water yield away. It's going to cause a water shortage. You know, this is how they're interpreting that lack of runoff that the forests are creating. Now, William Bray was a forester, worked for the Department of the Interior in 1904. And he saw the same situation that the other folks saw, but he saw it in a different way. So I'm going to read his what he sees here. He says, one of the most important services of a forest rain upon the runoff. Oops, just a minute. Get back in here. I'm trying to diminish the screen so I can read all the letters here. Bear with me 1 second. There we go. Upon the falling rain and upon the runoff. In this way, it both checks erosion and promotes the entrance of water into the earth. In the first place, the crowns of the trees, especially when the foliage is on, breaks the force of the rain and cause it to run harmlessly down the trunk or to drip slowly through the canopy. Further, the organic debris of the forest floor holds back the fallen water until it has had time to soak into the soil. The spreading and interlacing network of roots serves the same purpose and binds the soil fast against erosion. Thus, the rain is kept from swift discharge into the streams. Gullying is prevented. The runoff does not gain sudden volume and velocity after a downpour. The removal of timber from a broken or mountainous area is pretty sure to be followed by more frequent and destructive floods. A forest also increases the water supply from a region by increasing the moisture holding capacity of the soil. The undecomposed litter, which forms the upper layer of the forest floor, will itself take up much water as well as delay its runoff. A thick mat of leaves will be wet a little distance down long after those on top have become thoroughly dry. Still lower, the half-decayed rubbish is like a sponge in its water-holding power. And finally, the humus or forest soil proper, with its loose texture and large proportion of organic matter, is peculiarly fitted to delay percolation. Thus, the forest builds up a storage reservoir, the loss of which often makes necessary the construction on a large scale of artificial lakes to conserve the water supply. This work the forest does not only without expense, but while itself growing wood. So his basic summary is that the deep roots of the trees reduce the erosion and the loss of soil, and that the forest and the soils are a significant water storage, just like a reservoir, just like the Lake Travis Reservoir. All over the forested areas, you have soil that stores the water. Creeks also have a limited recharge capacity, so whatever they can't take in to recharge the aquifers underneath them and feed the springs and the wells, that the remainder is going to run off into the Gulf of Mexico. Maybe it'll come back in rainfall. Forests do reduce the runoff directed to the creeks. And so the runoff that goes to the creeks increases the flooding problem. So the forests help to diminish the flooding problem. And unless you have artificial reservoir, the runoff to the creeks don't really lead to sustained flows. Those are only really support the flood flows. And most of our creeks are spring fed. So this is why you don't want to have more runoff diverted to the creeks, but you want it to go in the ground to the extent possible. Another example I'll give you is that the early pioneers and ranchers wanted to extensively manipulate the surface to keep water at the surface. Okay, so they made stock ponds. Almost every ranch I see has 3 or 4 stock ponds. It was originally a sinkhole, plug the bottom, and it would capture the water so they can feed their cattle. And so in many other ways, they wanted to keep water in the creek flowing. They didn't want it to go down into the ground. Okay, and so here's an example on one of our preserve tracks of a sinkhole that in 2012, you know, it's raining, the sinkhole's plugged completely. It's ponding water with about 4 feet of water. So I got a crew out there that this is what we do, is we dig open these sinkholes to unplug them. And this is what it looks like restored, the sinkhole, where it takes all the water now that flows to it. And part of the reason why these things are plugged with water is they're intentionally plugged, but also they tend to get erosion from the cattle, or the ranchers driving back and forth across the ranch site will tend to erode, or the deforestation, if they're clearing the trees, will tend to have sediment that's going to fill these recharge features. So Blanco River is another example, and here's a picture on the left of Blanco River at the mouth of Halifax Creek, where in the 1890s, the pioneers at the time didn't like the fact that there's a cave in the creek in the river here that took all the flow of the Blanco River. So in the 1890s, they made a concerted effort to plug this, because in Kyle area downstream, they had a mill, and the mill never turned because all the water went downstream in this cave. And I know about many other cases of caves that were either filled or attempted to be filled in the Blanco River basin. So what effect do you think that has on the flooding that happened later on the Blanco River, when all of the recharge features are filled, when a lot of management efforts are made to have the runoff going to the creeks rather than going into the ground? So this is kind of what Bray was talking about. Here's a little diagram showing the differences between vegetative areas where you have the infiltration and absorption going on, and unforested areas or bare areas where you're having a lot more runoff and the compaction, not much infiltration going on here. You have maybe some evaporation. So also forests have roots that enhance the infiltration. And here's some studies that have shown that. The picture on the top there is Adrian Lindley had these rings that were pretty large that would pour water into, and he would see over a large area what the infiltration rate of different areas were. And the graph in front of you here is showing lots of small sinkholes that he tested. That's his primary focus. But the largest values he actually saw, well, yeah, some of them were open sinkholes in solution cavities, but some of the largest were actually juniper root areas in the Trinity Aquifer, where the roots were acting as macropores, allowing the water to get through the soil. And this is not inconsistent with what other researchers saw. Vireo saw the same thing with oak grove plots, that the oak roots allowed more infiltration than the grass-dominated study plots that had shallower roots. And a 1990 study by Slaughter also found that that 4 juniper-dominated study areas had a lot higher infiltration than the grass-dominated study sites. He said the grass sites usually after 5 minutes start generating runoff, and certainly the soils weren't saturated after 5 minutes, but the limited capacity of the soils in a grass-dominated area forced the water to run off the site. So I did some studies on myself on a catchment, which is a water basin area, using these climate towers. There's a 50-foot climate tower. This happens to be across from the Wildflower Center on the J17 water quality protection land. And this tower can measure the evaporation and the transpiration over a large area, something like a mile, averages out. And then I've got some other devices to measure how much runoff goes on and the soil moisture. And my purpose on this was pretty much to measure what the recharge was in the Austin area for the first time by measuring all the components of rainfall. And then the remainder was the recharge. So evaporation is the liquid water that's converted into gas. And in the process, it absorbs heat and changes to the gas vapor. So it cools off through the process of evaporating. Transpiration is a loss of water by plants. They use it for cooling. And also they're getting intake of nutrients from the soil. And they also intake the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the process of transpiration. Either one of these produces a water vapor to the air that I can measure over a distance with this tower. This is actual evapotranspiration using a tower, measuring it. Other people will talk about they measured evapotranspiration with a pan of water. And this is a different kind of evaporation. It's called a potential evaporation. I want to distinguish the differences because it's kind of confusing for a lot of people. In my tower area, the evaporation might reduce once the soil moisture is lower. You know, there's not enough water available, so it kind of slows down. But in a potential evaporation, it's something like a lake, really, where you have water all the time, and you're not limited by the lack of water. So how much water would evaporate if you have no limit to water, like in an ocean or a lake? So those are the two differences between the two types of evaporation you can measure. This is kind of what my study site looked like from the tower across from the Wildflower Center there at J17. And I measured the runoff using this device called a flume that I put in the channel, and it continuously measures how much water goes through that. And so to measure my recharge, I measured the rainfall, subtracted the evapotranspiration that I measured with the tower. I measured the runoff in the flume, and I also measured soil moisture storage, which is the change in moisture in the soil, because there's actually, like Bray said, there's a lot of storage in the soil. And what if you compared a time when the water was full in the soil, high soil moisture volume, as opposed to where it's nearly dry? You know, you're going to have a lot of change in moisture. Just, it's sort of like if you have a bathtub full of water and you empty it out, you know. One case there's a lot more water than the other. They're not the same conditions. So I use the soil moisture to tell whether the conditions are the same for comparing the start and an end of a water balance. This is what I was doing to try to figure out the components of rainfall and what happened. And for the first time, I got to measure in the Austin area. And so people said, well, wait, what about your tower was actually in a big sinkhole, so you're going to have higher recharge values. And so the other thing I did is I pulled together a bunch of other people that were doing, or several other people that were doing similar studies across central Texas. And I annualized their data to show how much evaporation and transpiration, which is the line on here, as a percentage of rainfall was occurring. And I used this my purpose was to measure the recharge. So my site is only the one square with the circle there, headquarter flat sink, whereas the other sites, mostly they were geared toward looking at the difference between grasslands and forests to see the difference of how much the vegetation took as far as evapotranspiration. So here's the measurement here. The difference between 100% in the line or the dot you're measuring is the out of rainfall is the runoff plus the recharge on it. And most of the sites under average condition, about 3% of the rainfall is runoff to the creeks. So the rest is going to be the recharge that occurs through the soil. And so when it's on the left-hand side, one of the differences is you'll see that the evaporation gets really high. It goes even 100% over. And that's because you're not getting rain in and you're losing water from the soil itself. And you can actually lose more water than you gain in rainfall. And that's why it can be over 100%. So briefly, I'm going to show you some of the differences I saw here in this one. I was using this again to calculate recharge as my primary purpose, so that and what I calculated from this is that under average conditions of the rainfall that falls on the Central Texas area, about 68% evaporates or transpirates, 3% runs off to the creeks, and 28% recharges the aquifers through the soil. And this is pretty much true whether you're on the Trinity Aquifer or the Edwards Aquifer. I'm surprised that they're really similar. And there are slight differences between whether they're forested or grasslands. So I showed their differences to show a general difference between the two. I didn't really talk about it in the article about trying to analyze the difference, because one thing, the data is not really there. The second reason is that when I say it's wooded or savanna, you know, like say on Honey Creek where they said they cleared 80% of the trees. Well, I call that a savanna, but maybe technically that might be a grassland or some other, you know, we didn't try to quantify it with canopy cover or something like that. So it's just meant for a general difference between wooded areas and savanna areas. But what I did kind of glean out of here is that a few of the sites showed over an annual basis that there was higher evapotranspiration losses in the forest and the savanna. And this is what people expect, because trees use water, right? So the trees are going to use more water in evaporation and transpiration than others. But we saw that in only 4 of the cases, really. You know, did we see that to be the case? In some other cases, particularly during drought conditions, the evapotranspiration losses were actually higher in the savanna grasslands than in the forests. So maybe the evaporation was a lot higher, hotter. You know, it's evaporating more water during the drought periods. And then a whole lot of them, you know, showed really no difference between the grassland and particularly during the wetter periods that were measured, you know. And one of the things I want to point out here in my early exploration here to try to measure the recharge in the Austin area, it was kind of assumed, like everyone else looks at it, that evaporation is lost. You know, it's just this water that's wasted, it's gone, it's in the air, gone, right? But the reality is that water moisture that goes in the air goes somewhere. It doesn't just disappear, right, in a vortex. So we're going to examine that in the rest of the talk here. What happens to that water that goes off here? So here's a diagram that kind of shows the difference between bare soil where you have just evaporation, and then one where you have transpiration and evaporation. So the question is high evaporation and transpiration bad? Okay, so the process of evaporating and transpirating water results in cooling. So if you like cooler temperatures, you might think evaporation and transpiration are good. During heavy rainfall conditions, the factors that reduce the soil moisture can also reduce downstream flooding. So if the water is stored in the soil and doesn't go downstream, you help to reduce downstream flooding. Also, the evaporation and transpiration that's lost to the atmosphere produces rainfall downwind. It's estimated that about 61% of the terrestrial rainfall across the world is actually derived from the land surface and not from the oceans, which is surprising. So a lot of it's coming from the land surface. Part of that is because the leaves and the water have so many layers of you know, as opposed to one layer of an ocean surface that can produce a lot of water flux. Even though there's a lot more water in the ocean, there's a lot more water flux in the air over vegetated environments. So the low pressure from the rising flux is hypothesized to draw rainfall. It's called the Bodic pump hypothesis. So if you've got moisture-laden water going up, produces a low pressure system that's drawing in rainfall from other areas. And historically, this was looked at as that somehow it looks like forests draw water in, but wasn't proven until recently. I'll talk about that. If you have hot, dry air rising, it seems to be associated with high pressure systems that repel the rain fronts, kind of like what we talked about in the high plains, right? So here's the Bodic pump we'll talk about. One of the first suggestions of this was a study by Shukla and Mintz, was a model where they simulated a vegetated environment across the world and then a cleared environment across the world. And basically they saw that we had vegetation in soils that significantly increases the rainfall and decreases the summer temperatures, although the results will vary between areas. Now, interpreted for Central Texas, on their model where you had vegetation, the temperatures were about 40 degrees cooler than where you had unvegetated and no soil moisture. The rainfall in July was about twice as much or more in July in Central Texas in the vegetated simulated areas than in the deforested areas. So that was kind of interesting to show the greater rainfall and lower temperatures from vegetation. So do forests attract rainfall? One of the factors has to do with the biological aerosols that plants give off, and they may play a role in rainfall, causing rain to precipitate or fall. And as I mentioned to you, the leaf area surfaces in a forest has a lot more surface area than the surface area of an ocean, okay? And so they can produce a lot of water flux, more so than even an ocean area. Even though there's more water available in the ocean, you've got a limited surface area on top of it that can evaporate. Also, the rising water flux creates a low pressure rising system that draws in the coastal currents. So this hypothesis is called the Bodic pump hypothesis, was primarily pushed by this Russian scientist Makareva. And here's her 2009 paper for some of the justification of it. She said, look at, you know, for example, the United States. This is number 4 on the map, and compare it to 5, you know, which is China. The United States has a lot more forest in this region 4 than Asia has in 5. And when you look at the rain, they're not evenly, they're not even compared to the distance from the ocean, even though the winds are going in the same direction. In East Asia, the rains are diminishing a lot faster from the coast than in North America, which has a lot more vegetation in it. And she provided examples in other areas too, to say, yeah, there is support that rainfall actually does draw, the vegetation actually does draw rainfall. So I'm gonna give you a few cases of where this appeared to have happened. So I gave you the example of the Sahara Desert in the beginning being so hot. And the history of the Sahara Desert is that in the Ethiopia region, in the past, about 2.9 million years ago, it was forested, had ferns. And then when humans started appearing about 2 million years ago, and you start seeing human artifacts in the soil, the landscape changed to more of a grassland. The rainfall diminished. The monsoons that usually bring the rainfall from the Mediterranean stopped coming. Wright also did a study that showed that he tied the increasing human population, the spread of domesticated livestock, the introduction of fire landscape management in the Sahara region, to the transformation of forest to shrubland, accelerated rates of erosion that could be seen in the Nile Valley, and the resulting deforestation resulted in localized warming that resulted in a climate change where the monsoon rains wouldn't come anymore, and resulted in the desert that we see in the area now. Here's another example that Milian used to explain the fact that you have these unusual floods in Europe and the lack of summer storms in the Mediterranean area. And here in the diagram, he's showing two scenarios. One, we have a lot of vegetation, and the second one down below, we have less. And the problem with the one below is that you're getting these moisture-laden waters coming off of the Mediterranean, but it doesn't have enough moisture to make a front, and so it gets kind of backed up. These fronts get backed up until you get enough coming, and then you have this whirlwind storm coming that hits Europe. Whereas where you have the vegetation, the flux of the vegetation supplements the water coming off the coast and provides enough moisture to create rainfall where it doesn't get backed up. So here's another case in Greece. This is written 360 years ago. Greece went through a similar transformation as we saw in the Sahara Desert region. And Plato wrote 360 million years before Christ. So this is 2,360 years ago, basically. He said the land was the best in the world and therefore able in those days to support a vast army raised from the surrounding people. Many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years, for that is the number of years that have elapsed since the time of which I'm speaking. During all this time and through so many changes, there's never been any considerable accumulation of soil coming down from the mountains, as in other places, but the earth has fallen away all around, sunk out of sight. The consequence is that in comparison of what then was, there are remaining only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called, as in the case of small islands, all the richer and softer parts of the soil having fallen away, and the mere skeleton of the land being left. But in the primitive state of the country, its mountains were high hills covered with soil. The plains, as they were termed by us, of Felis, were full of rich earth, and there was abundance of wood in the mountains. Of this last, the traces still remain, for although some of the mountains now only afford subsistence to bees, not so long ago, there were still to be seen roofs of timber cut from the trees growing there, which were the size sufficient to cover the largest houses. And there were many other high trees cultivated by man and bearing abundance of food for cattle. Moreover, the land reaped the benefit of the annual rainfall, not as now, losing the water which flows off the bare earth into the sea, but having an abundant supply in all places and receiving it into herself and treasuring it up in the close clay soil. It let off into the hollows of the streams, which it absorbed from the heights, providing everywhere the abundant fountains and rivers, of which there still be observed sacred memorials in places where the fountains once existed. So modern Greece, after it's transformed from the forested area to the maquis, is what they call it. A lot of soil loss, diminished rainfall now, a lot less rainfall than it used to have. Very much wildfire risk now. These are wildfires now that can spread across the entire country in a fire season. The soil is too thin and degraded for forest succession. So many of you have been out to the Vireo Preserve have probably seen this scenario where the soils are eroded away as a result of the deforestation for cattle grazing. The West Bank fire of 1961, large trees can't grow anymore because the soil is not there. So let's look at this other exotic place real quickly. This is called Texas. And you remember the illustration I showed you in the beginning where Carr showed the high plains region, which has this high pressure system that seems to keep the storm fronts away. And you'll notice also that it's, kind of lacks the vegetation. So whether that's a coincidence or not, that whether the fact that the high pressure system is because the vegetation's not there, or vice versa. You know, I suspect that if you looked at it, the vegetation there probably has a lot to do with where the rainfall goes and where it doesn't go. Here's also a study in Texas by Brad Wilcox. Now, historically in the 1940s was the climax of livestock breeding in central Texas. So before then, there was a lot of clearing to be able to cultivate areas for livestock grazing. And since the 1940s, everyone agreed that trees have been growing back, or growing for the first time, depending on how you looked at it. And so Brad Wilcox says, well, if that's the case, and everybody knows that trees dry up the aquifers, then the aquifers should be drying up. So he compared the spring flows since the 1940s and saw that they've actually increased in all of these river basins rather than decreased. You know, the trees aren't drying up the aquifers, apparently. Here's another look at the in Central Texas area, and what they saw was increasing rainfall. They said it got wetter after about 1960. Don't know why, but somehow Central Texas started getting wetter, and that's contrary to the climate change expectations, where things would be getting drier. But since the 1960s, Central Texas is getting wetter. Barton Springs has flowed more. The rivers are flowing stronger. So that's interesting to look at. So here's my conclusions. A large portion of climate change is local as a result of land use changes, particularly deforestation. The forests and soils work together to create a large water storage reservoir. The evaporating water flux may attract rain. The Central Texas forest regions can be expected to be at least 20 to 45 degrees warmer, possibly as much as 77 degrees higher if you reach the advanced state of desertification, if forests were cleared. The forested landscapes have less runoff compared to grasslands, on an average 33 to 44% lower, which could mean less flooding severity downstream, possibly more local recharge, possibly less water reaching the Gulf of Mexico from our area. The loss of forest and soil can result in the transformation to a drier grassland and shrub that's more susceptible to wildfire and more extreme desertification. And then our study, as all these other things, certainly need more study to examine all of this climate variables and to understand it better. So here's my end. Go team. And I'm going to end my presentation here and turn it back over to Audrey.
Thank you, Nico.
Let me stop sharing.
Sure. And then while Jim is getting up his presentation, I'll go ahead and introduce Jim. Again, just a reminder, if you've got questions, go ahead and put them in the question and answer session. We'll be asking questions of Nico and Jim after Jim's presentation. So Jim ODonnell, for more than 30 years, Jim's combined his love of teaching biology and environmental stewardship to help protect the black-capped vireo and endangered golden cheek warbler in Central Texas. He taught science and environmental education in Dripping Springs for 28 years. During that time, he was instrumental in setting aside the 214-acre tract of land that is now known as the Vireo Preserve, which once supported the largest concentration of black-capped vireos in Travis County. As a result of his efforts and knowledge of the endangered songbirds and their ecosystems, Jim was appointed to the Biological Advisory Team that provided the basis and support for the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, a system of preserves established under a Federal Endangered Species Act permit to protect multiple endangered and rare species in Travis County. After retiring from teaching in 2009, Jim has spent the last 11, maybe 12, 11, yeah, almost 12, years designing and implementing habitat restoration on the Vireo Preserve, which is now owned and managed by the City of Austin as part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. Jim uses his knowledge of the species, plants, permaculture, and teaching to implement regenerative habitat restoration projects with a community of volunteers to benefit a variety of native Texas hill country ecosystems. He regularly gives presentations to numerous state and local groups and was a presenter at the 2019 Global Earth Repair Conference in Port Townsend, Washington on this topic. Welcome, Jim, and take it away.
Yes, thank you so much, Audrey, and thank you, Nico, for that presentation. This is a very exciting thing that we're doing here. So let's go ahead and get started here. As Audrey pointed out, the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve is about 32,000 acres. The Vireo Preserve, the area that I do most of my work, supports black-capped vireo habitat as well as golden cheek warbler habitat. And we also have some very long-term, 80 years plus, degraded areas. Our goal is to restore these areas to provide habitat for one or both of these species. And lessons learned here, and these are hard lessons, we apply to other areas. Most of my work is in the areas that are most degraded on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. And we have these beautiful, beautiful lands that are set aside that are just gorgeous. But we also have land that's not. And according to our permit, we need to convert those areas into the black-capped vireo habitat or golden cheek warbler habitat. And on some of these properties, it's neither, and we're trying to convert that over. Okay, so as I said, I do most of my work on the Vireo Preserve, and this is from William Bray, which Nico mentioned in 1904. He was in the area of the Vireo Preserve Wild Basin, and he took this picture describing an almost impenetrable growth of cedar and mixed timber. So there was quite a bit of diversity in this layer as well, and rich soil. He turned his camera to an area that was cleared of juniper. Cedar chopping was a business during this time period, along with cattle ranching. And so the area was cleared, and it was denuded soil down to the rock, and very much the way Plato described Greece back in the day. So one of the things that are certainly a valuable lesson here in the hill country is never, never, never clear your hillsides, because it's very difficult to restore those areas once they're cleared. So Bray also had, looking at, Nico made these points, but his conclusions were that forests build soils, forests protect soils from erosion, and we definitely see that a lot in some of our BCP properties where the trees are taken away. Erosion is a major problem. I spend a lot of time dealing with that. Forest soils act as a sponge, and we're going to be talking about the soil sponge here in a second. This is an example of some prime habitat. This is an example on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, a prime forest habitat of golden cheek warblers, and aquatic habitat, springs. As Nico mentioned, a lot of our water comes from springs, and our forests keep the landscape hydrated. So this is an area where we have Jollyville Plateau salamanders. And Jollyville Plateau salamanders require clear, clean, consistent water. It's not like we can just kind of dry it up or have it, if it's contaminated anyway, we don't have them. This is an area on the Vireo Preserve that was cleared, probably back around Bray's time. And you can see this juniper here, and it's holding some soil in place. It's actually building soil, and it protects from further erosion. But note the bunch grasses, and a lot of people think, well, if I clear the hillside and throw some grass seed or something down, it's all going to be this lush grassland. Well, that's not the case here. If you see the little bunch grasses here, and we collected some of the soil from under the juniper tree and bunch grass, and you can see a close-up comparing the Caliche subsoil on the right with the topsoil under the forest canopy. Quite a bit richer, and we're going to talk about structure of soil here in just a second. So organic carbon in that soil, we had it measured, and under that juniper motte, and that's a pretty harsh environment there, it had the soil organic matter was 10%. Now, given the fact that organic farmers love to get their organic matter up to 5%, and that's considered really great, most farmland is around 1 or 2%, and here the bunch grass actually had 2%. The importance of soil carbon is soil carbon captures and stores more rainfall while reducing runoff and the resulting flooding, less vulnerable to erosion, more resistant to drought, and stores nutrients and increases the fertility. And this is the soil that we're taking out underneath a mature ash juniper and one of our woodlands. Now, a big bonus to me, and I think it should be for everybody, and this is from the USDA, that for every 1% of organic matter in the top 6 inches of soil, will hold approximately 27,000 gallons of water per acre. So adding organic matter and building that soil holds more water and hydrates that landscape. This is an all too common picture in the hill country here, drawing out the landscape and releasing CO2. The whole idea in restoration work is to capture CO2 and bring it back down into the ground. These practices release CO2, clear cutting, burning, biocides, and overgrazing. And all of these practices have been being done since the, since 1940s plus for biocides, but the others, clear cutting, burning, and overgrazing, has been going on in Central Texas since the mid-1800s. And if all of this worked the way it's sometimes sold, we would have this Garden of Eden, but that's not the case. Soil temperatures without canopy and with canopy here. This was a day last summer, it was 104 degrees outside. So I thought, well, let's measure the soil temperatures here. And on the Caliche out there in the open, it was 120 degrees. We've gotten it up to 140 degrees on that Caliche. And then in the woodlands, and this was not like a forest. This was just a woody patch alongside the road. It was 87 degrees in there. Big difference in just a few feet. So this is a diagram showing the role of ecosystems and how they regulate climate. Nico covered this. I won't spend much time on this, but soil that's bare and compacted, again, getting up to 140 degrees. Rainfall is rejected. The soil becomes hydrophobic and water just runs off of that stuff. So it doesn't matter how much rain you get. You can say, well, we got 10 inches of rain. That should hydrate everything. No, it just runs off the landscape if the soil is compacted. Also, as the heat from the albedo effect goes up into the atmosphere, if there's pollution, smoke, dust, all of that stuff causes a haze, which actually warms up the environment even more. On the other side, if we treat our soils right, rainfall that infiltrates into the soil, our temperatures can be as low as 70 degrees in these forests. And as we have transpiration is a good thing in the forest, because for every gram of water that is transpired out of the stomata, the underside of the leaf, 590 heat calories are released. So sometimes when you walk into a woodland in the summertime, you think, it's cool in here. It's almost like an air conditioning. It's not just because of the shade, it's because of that release of heat from the trees. Now, as that heat goes up and as those particles are released on the underside, again, the stomata, it releases bacteria. And there are three things that need to happen in order to make rainfall. So as that vapor goes up into the atmosphere, water condenses on these particles, but specific particles like ice, salt, and bacteria. That's what water vapor condenses on to form clouds and then rain. It doesn't form on dust or smoke. So in order to make more clouds, to lower the air pressure, and to get rain, we need to have these forests. Okay, so how do we rehydrate and restore degraded landscapes? Well, if we keep doing the same thing over and over again, it's kind of insane. And we do a lot of that. And this is a lot of what I see. And this is what we need to convert into an old growth woodland for golden cheek warblers. Well, it's going to take some time. So this is an interesting little demonstration that you can do at home with your kids. And it kind of illustrates compacted soils and spongy soils. So here's some flour. And so I just got a little pie pan, put some flour in it. And this was actually out at the Vireo Preserve. And you can kind of see where the wind was blowing around the flour. So I was losing some of my compacted soil, blowing on the side here. So wind erosion was happening here. I pour some water on top of this flour, and it's compacted. There's no space for air or water or roots. This is what happens a lot in our compacted soils. There's reduced plant cover, so it's high albedo. This is going to be a hot surface if this was a real surface. Notice how it's pooling up here. Okay, that's bad for plants because it's poor drainage and eventually just sort of runs off and doesn't soak in. So we have runoff here. If you look around here, look at how dirty that water is running off. So it's just running off the surface here, and it takes, you know, in nature, it would take pollution, the pollution and biocides and cause erosion like rails and head cuts and things like rails and head cuts and things like that. So now this is a piece of bread, and notice that it's very porous. And this is what we mean by a soil sponge. So porous space is the soil aggregates are held together by carbon glues or glomalin. And healthy soil is 66% space. So glomalins are actually, it's a kind of a new term. It wasn't even discovered until 1996 by Sarah Wright. And glomalins are secreted by our arbuscular mycorrhizal fungus, which grows in woodlands. And it secretes out this little sticky substance that binds the particles together in order to create space. And you can see in this piece of bread, you had yeast, which is a living thing, right? And so you have it, you know, representing the microorganisms in the soil, creating space. Now, when I pour water on top of this, which there is, it's hard to see, but this is wet bread. And you can see that there's very little water, and it's clean, that's on the outside of the pie pan there. Now, what happens with this, and what happens in nature as well, is the water is going to soak down into the bread and then hit the hard surface and then move sideways out. And that's how we create springs. So once it hits an impermeable layer, the water moves across and then comes out as a spring or recharges as spring. So here's an area that was extremely degraded. And we started doing the rehydration and restoration work on this about a year ago. And to do this work, we added tons of biodiversity back in there. We did massive planting and seeding in here. We added biomass and with surface mulch. We added organic matter and the planting, all those roots are adding organic matter into the soil, building a soil sponge. And we also did some earthwork in here to capture water so that we could keep it on site. What was happening on this site before, it was pretty much just caliche with sparse grass growing, and you know, water was just running off of it. This is on another site. If you look on February of 2016, this is on one of our other tracks, double J and T, and it's a caliche bench or balcones, and the only thing that's growing there is a little Dominita. And this has been this way probably for 100 years. You know, we tried a few things by adding organic matter to it. And there's a hill off to the side, and every time it rained, it just washed off the organic matter. So did a little earthwork on here, creating places for water to collect. And just in August of 2016, you can see the change, and that's August. Now you can't see the site because it's full of trees. Some of the trees are things that I planted, but several of them are trees that just came up on their own. And there's frogs there. Okay, this is another project talking about how we rebuild some of these areas. This is on the Vireo Preserve. We called it the dead zone because it had been dead basically since 1940 on the aerial photographs that we had. So we thought, well, you know, we can change this. And so with the help of some of our great volunteers, this is what it looked like 2 years later. And what we did here is we put some small bioswales in, and they're on contour. And what I was doing there is I was directing the water that was running down the road and eroding the spot downhill from it. Let me go back. You can see the road that these guys are walking on. And water would just run down this road and take out the vegetation down the way. It was killing these oak trees down below. So basically, I just rerouted the water into these little swales, okay? That created water in this system. And then we seeded it with grass seed. We also have trees growing in this now, and it just came back very well. Now, to get it to do this, you can see the mulch that we put on here. It's called sheet mulching. And so it's basically mulch that we get from development sites. It's free to us. And then we make our own compost, so we mix it with mulch and compost to create a layer there of organic matter. And then after a year or so, we seed that, and then it's off on its own, and we don't have to do anything else with it. And this is it 3 years later, just holding water, and it's on its own. So, with Mother Nature out there, sometimes we just knock it off its tracks because of the land use, previous land use, and especially the areas I work in. And it's just a little helping hand. It's just getting it started. And then we can back off and kind of go, yeah, this is great. And on top of that, these areas are loaded with wildlife now. There's insects, there's birds, and it's just so nice to walk through there and have lesser goldfinches singing away, So it's really cool. So berms and swales, let's talk a little bit about how they work. Using berms and swales to rehydrate dry hillsides. I only use berms and swales on our most degraded areas. To be a candidate for a berm and swale, you have to pretty much be, a degraded landscape for about 80 years, since the earliest photographs that we have. And landscapes are never, just staying the same. They're not static. They're either degrading or they're regenerating and doing their thing. If it shows me that it's degrading and we show there's erosion continuing to happen, we'll go in and do some berms and swales. They're also called terrace and contour trenching. Everybody has a different name for them. And how this works is water that comes across on the landscape goes into the swale, and literally thousands of gallons soak into the berm here and then pool down below and then slowly plume downhill. And these areas become very lush very fast, and it's an amazing change. This is done all over the world. We certainly didn't make this up. And this is the Loose Plateau in China. Huge restoration project. John D. Liu, if you want to look him up or Google him, he reported on this, and it's just an amazing transformation they did in China for restoration. The size of Belgium is the restoration that they did there, and you can see that they were basically in poverty in this area of China. It's the cradle of Chinese civilization, and you can see how they've changed that. So Afghanistan, Africa, and a really cool one is being done in India. It's called the Pawnee Project, and it's village against village of who can collect the most water, and there's a prize involved with it. So if we ever want to take on Westlake Hills or something like that, I think we could beat them on that. So bioswales, this was a project that we started last year in October 2019. And we use a laser leveler to align the bioswale. So everything's on contour. We want that water to, be captured, spread, and sink. And you can kind of see there just how degraded that is. And it's been that way for quite some time. And we could plant trees there or something, and they would just die. You throw seeds out there, and the birds would eat them, which is not a bad thing, but it's not the intention that I have. So we did some digging. We have a guy named Pete. He's kind of a genius at this. He digs these on contours. He's kind of a gifted guy on this kind of thing. And see, he dug 3 along berms and swales on this hillside. And then we had lots of volunteer help with tree planting. I think we planted 80 trees in a day there. And I couldn't do this without volunteers. And there's a lot of instruction going on, teaching people how to plant trees and teaching them these concepts. And this is what it looked like this summer. You can see some of the sunflowers and things growing in here. Our trees are caged for now. Once they get big enough, we'll take the cages off. But you can see this is the swale. Water goes into this, and next picture here. Well, me go back here. So water comes here and it plumes into the berm, and it just magic happens, because not only on the berm itself, but in between the berms, areas where I didn't know, for example, Tatalinco is growing in these areas, and we didn't seed that. It just came up. It was in the seed bank, and when the moisture was right, it started coming up. So we have all sorts of stuff coming up in this area that was really degraded. So this is still part of the project. You know, we're doing anything to slow up water and capture water. We got a lot of rocks, and so we made some rock berms on here through organic matter on this hillside. And this is a project that's just above an old growth endangered species habitat for golden cheek warblers. So part of the reason we did this project here was to keep flooding issues from going down and disturbing our old growth woodlands. So now it's all captured up there, and I suspect it's going to benefit some of the karst features that are just down below us here, and maybe get some springs rolling again down there. A lot of water, thousands and thousands of gallons of water in a rainfall. You can see it here. This is the spring of 2020, and you know, this water goes into the swale here, and within an hour or two, it's in the berm and pluming downhill. So it doesn't hold in these swales. It infiltrates right on in. One other project here. This is a great volunteer project. This was an eyesore for me for many years. It's right across from the dead zone. This is caliche. For people who don't know caliche, it's just the mineral matter. All the organic matter is pretty much stripped away. Soil is made up of sand, silt, and clay and organic matter. This is missing the organic matter. And so we thought, and you can see this hillside back here. This is a west-facing hillside, so it's going to be really dry. And and water's going to come down here and wash away anything if we're not careful. So, oops, skip ahead. So what we did here is we had to aerate this caliche, literally with picks. We went in there just to kind of break the surface tension a bit. The idea here is to slow the runoff from the slope above. We used the rock berms and logs to capture water, you know, so I got a little rock berm there, right along the roadside. We sheet mulch this area, which again is this compost and leaves. We seeded and planted things that will do well on a west-facing slope. And I like baccharis. A lot of people don't like baccharis, which is poverty weed, is another name for a Roosevelt weed. It is a great little fast-growing, deep-rooted plant. It grows down and opens up that soil, and monarch butterflies love the flowers in the fall. So we have a lot of that, and it gives shade and protection to the little trees that are coming up underneath it. And what I'll do with this baccharis, it's really fast-growing, is I keep cutting it back, and I use it for mulch. And if I need mulch for a particular project or this area, we just keep cutting it back to enrich the soil. So it's like this. It's great. It was free. So this is the soil. You know, remember the caliche where it was just hard packed, and that's the caliche underneath it on another site. But after a few years, I got a layer of nice humus up here. Got plants growing in this. I kind of hated digging this up. You can see the root going down. This is going to add the organic matter and open up the soil. I'm turning this caliche now into, you know, where it's got some organic matter there. This thing holds a lot of water now. So it's an easy fix. And it's all this stuff, you know, leaves and compost. And so it's a fairly cheap thing to do. And it's a fun volunteer project. This is our latest project here. This is a berm and swale that's a half a mile long on a really degraded slope. And it is, I work on this just about almost every day now. And you can kind of see here, this is before we dug the berms and swales. And you can see that soil there, and it's been this way for many, many years. This ranch, the upland area of this ranch, was highly disturbed, clear cut, overgrazed, goats, the whole thing. But down in the canyons and the valleys there, there's golden cheek warblers. That's where I do my survey work in the springtime, and it's wonderful habitat down there. It's about 2,000 acres, this ranch, and it's a lot of work. So this is another picture of it, and you can see the sheet of erosion just coming down in a heavy rain. We lose what little soil there is there. This is up close. Kind of fascinated with this stuff. And then we had Pete again digging. He dug a half a mile of this, and these berms here are about 8 to 10 feet across, and the swales are about 8 feet across. And this is, we get all this mulch from construction sites, and we just truck it in. This is the beginning of it, and this is where we were the other day. So here's the swale coming down here. Here's the berm, and it just goes on and on and on all around this Balcones. And we will plant hundreds and hundreds of trees with lots of diversity. This area right now, you know, I was talking about songbirds and life and stuff like that in the restored areas. That's not here. This area, it's kind of a juniper, live oak, persimmon, agarita. That's it. You know, that kind of place. And there's not a lot of life there and diversity to support all the little critters that we want involved out here. And so we'll plant hundreds of trees along this half mile and a lot of diversity. So moving along here. So we even have master naturalists class out, and they did a great project. They dug this by hand, which is really challenging. And they did this at the Vireo Preserve, and they have trees planted in there, and they take care of those for us. And almost moving along here. So one rock berms, I just want to show you, it's not all berms and swales. We also did these one rock berms on these hillsides that need them. This is, we had a lot of erosion of topsoil here due to clear cutting and fire and the history of this property. It's a west-facing dry slope. So I have rocks on contour. They're about 3 feet wide and 1 rock high. That's why it's called one rock berms. And it captures and slows down water. We sheet mulch behind it a little bit. And we put legume trees in there, tough guys that can deal with that west-facing slope. Sumac's also a great tree for that. We're going to heavily seed this with grasses and forbs and woody plants to build and stabilize the soil here. We have a lot of rocks, but we're also very careful about the rocks we pick. If they have critters underneath them, like ants or scorpions or whatever, that's their home, so we don't mess with those rocks. We get the rocks that are kind of not doing anything, you know. So we check underneath the rocks, and if the rocks are not busy, we'll use them on this project, put them to work. Terracing, we do some terrace working as well. This hill behind, oops, this, go back, almost done. This hill behind here was clear cut at one time, and it took out all the soil, this hillside here. So now we've terraced it, and life is coming back on there now to capture the water. We do some work in woodlands, not so much in the forest, but in the woodlands, sometimes we'll do these brush berms. And in these brush berms here, we just cut the lower branches off of juniper. We weave them in tightly together, and then we seed inside these to get things going. They hold moisture in there. And then we put logs down, inoculate them with turkey tail or other myceliums and funguses. And our check dams, the dams we have down in the woods, we'll put, you know, in the narrow creek areas, we'll do a little beaver dam, and that spreads water out and slows it up. Water still goes through, but it's just slower. So in these heavy rains. And the last thing I want to mention is that the UN has declared 2021 to 2030 is ecosystem restoration across the planet. So come out and get involved as soon as we get this pandemic thing out of our way. And beginning in 2021, I'm hoping to do a lot of restoration work with a lot of great volunteers. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jim. We have a few questions. First, with Nico's talk, Nico, how would you rate a metal, in parentheses, silver roof, for reflection, like related for albedo?
Yeah, so on the issue of albedo, you can actually feel it, you know, when you're wearing a black shirt versus a wet shirt in the summertime heat, or if you're in a black car versus a white car, you know, you can feel the effects of albedo. And so from a metal roof, you know, you would expect if it's kind of shiny that it's going to reflect the heat back, the radiation back, you know. but potentially if it's a rusty roof and it's kind of blackened from tarnish, you know, it might not reflect as much anymore. So I haven't measured roofs to tell you with certainty what the answer is.
Okay, great. How about, we've got a question from John, who has a question about the WQPL. So are we making a mistake in encouraging grasslands on the Onion Creek site?
And if you're asking me, I guess on it, the, you know, originally there was thought that grass uses less water than trees, and that's not very clear from the information we got as I showed you on the ET graphs, you know. So there's certain things about grasses that we do know is they tend to be warmer in the summertime compared to forests. They will tend to shed more runoff to the creeks, which some people saw as good. Generally now I think we think it's not that good to generate runoff to the creeks. It's better to go in the ground. So those are certainly some aspects about the differences. Other people thought that we want to put grasslands because that's what Texas originally was. It was all grassland back in the days. And with further research, you know, historical research that like Lisa O'Donnell is doing and Elizabeth McGreevy and other folks, and we're looking at it, or finding that probably that it was pretty forested also in the 1800s, but there was extensive deforestation. You know, you think about it when you had a land grant, pretty much everything you did from grazing to farming to cedar chopping involved clearing the trees on your lot. And some of these researchers found that we were shipping off in 1867, we were shipping off 300,000 straight logs of juniper to the East Coast. That's not even what we're using for here, for railroad ties, for fence posts, for building structures, you know. So certainly, and when we see our lands, we see lots of cedar stumps that are still there that were chopped a long time ago. Whole forests were chopped and replaced with these shorter, you know, younger junipers. And so anyway, we're learning more about it, and it's not clear that certainly Central Texas had a variety of some grassy prairies and some wooded areas, and some places that have invasive grasses, you know, like Commons Ford Park, invasive grasses. Well, native grasses are certainly better, even though that was probably originally a forested area that was cleared for a farmland. So hopefully I helped clarify that a little bit. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Jim.
Yeah, I think the issue that we have is not so much with the water quality protection lands, but all of Central Texas, in that they, you know, this mistaken belief that it was all prairie or all grassland, and that the trees are a problem. And that's a message that's out there all over the place, kind of the anti-juniper type stuff. And I think what we're doing here and what we're trying to do on a broader scale is just educate people on that there's a lot of damage that's done. And I think all you have to do is drive out to Fredericksburg or Kerrville, and you see a lot of degraded landscapes from that constant clear cutting and oak wilt that comes in because of it as well. So I think we just kind of need to sit back and you know, kind of look at it with a little bit of a different approach. Some of the messaging that's out there is just, you know, I need to clear my land, I need to get all the juniper off of it, and then you find out that the wind and the sun and everything just dries out your landscape, and you've spent a lot of money doing that. So I think that there needs just to be some more thoughtful approaches on that.
Okay, we have a few more questions and not much time, so we'll try to get through these. Elizabeth has asked, are brush berms different from windrows?
Well, they're, you know, the brush berms are pretty low to the ground, and they're woven pretty tightly, and so there's not a whole lot of difference in these. The whole idea is just to slow up water as it comes down a slope. So I'm kind of doing it just as in specific areas on slopes that are having a lot of water coming down them. There's not a whole lot to catch. So yeah, they're very similar.
Okay, and then we have a question from Robert. How can you best use shredded juniper?
There's a couple different kinds of juniper. There's shredded juniper and then there's chip juniper. Chip juniper tends to float, so if you put it down somewhere for erosion control, it will float. Where the shredded stuff is, it binds together, locks up together, and you can use it for mulch berms. We do a lot with mulch berms on hillsides. It needs to be about 4 feet wide, 1 foot high. If you're going to do 2 feet high, which would really be a big berm, you'd have to put it like 6 feet wide or something. But we use it a lot because we get a lot of it for erosion control and also pathways. We do a lot with pathways to keep people from wandering off the path and stepping on the vegetation that we just planted. So.
Great. And from Stuart, I love the practicality of the juniper twig berms seeded for woodland restoration. How much of a wildfire risk is it to do it that way?
Yeah. So that's a question that I get a fair amount, and so it's what we're doing when we do that is we're taking out all the dead branches that are closer to the ground. So we're kind of taking out some of that ladder fuel stuff anyway, but that's really not a huge issue for us. So we weave it up tight. It's only usually about a foot and a half tall, and then we seed it, and it stays fairly moist in there. And unless there's no ignition anywhere around, and it's maybe a couple of feet wide, and it may go several hundred yards, but there's going to be other issues. If there were a wildfire through there, that's not going to be the deal breaker there. If anything, it's going to be the more moist spot. So because there is vegetation that's coming up through those. So.
Got it. And then one final question from Stephanie. Do you coordinate your mulch drops with the city of Austin or the county, or how do you get that done?
It's done by, we just contact a developer who is going to be clearing the site out, and we just ask if we can have it. And usually we get it, but we have to pay for a truck to deliver it to us. So that's one of the ways we get stuff like that. Sometimes, they'll let you just come and pick it up, but they have safety regulations. They don't want to, they're not going to let just anybody go in there probably because of insurance issues and stuff. But yeah, we get a lot of it when we get it. And, but it's something that's free to us, but we usually have to pay the transportation.
Thank you so much, Nico and Jim, for this great presentation. We're going to post this again on our YouTube channel.
Well, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.